Makes a huge difference if you'll do me a favor by subscribing and liking the podcast wherever you listen. It goes a long way. Thanks, and I hope you enjoy. David Robson is an award-winning science writer specializing in the extremes of the human brain, body, and behavior. After graduating with a degree in mathematics from Cambridge University, he worked as a features editor at New Scientist for 5 years before moving to BBC Future, where he was a senior journalist for 5 years. His writings also appeared in The Guardian, The Atlantic, Men's Health, and in 2021, he received awards from the Association of British Science Writers and the UK Medical Journalists Association for his writing on misinformation and risk communication during the COVID pandemic. And in 2022, he was a finalist for the Best British Science Journalist of the Year award. His first book, The Intelligence Trap, was published in 2019 and received worldwide media attention. His second book, The Expectation Effect, was a BBC Radio 4 Book of the Week and won the British Psychological Society Book Award. His third book is The Laws of Connection. You can find more about him at Robson.me. We have the conversation about communication, connection, polarization in this world, social media, and I think it's a beautiful conversation, and I hope you enjoy. Awesome. All right. Well, David, it's afternoon, evening in UK, and morning here in the US, so welcome.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks for coming on. I wanted to start and ask you, what do you think with your research and your life experience, what are the dangers of feeling that we cannot relate to others?
Wow, I mean, there are so many dangers there. Yeah, I mean, I think, fundamentally, it's the pain, the emotional pain of loneliness. I think we've all experienced that at one point or another. And, something that I had, a lot of experience of when I was growing up, when I was incredibly shy, and, right through my 20s until my 30s, when I really started to recognize that actually connecting to others is just a lot easier than I had expected. But besides the emotional component, which is bad enough, the scientific research shows us that feeling disconnected from the people around us can also lead to a host of health problems. So it can predispose us to cardiovascular disease, to Alzheimer's disease. It can even increase our overall risk of mortality. So, the risks are real, and the need for a connection is fundamental. It's a major human drive, and that goes way back in our evolution.
Yeah, so you said like your 20s and 30s there, like you realized that it was easier than you thought. How did,
Yeah.
yeah, if you're willing to go there, how did that come about for you? Like that realization, that awareness?
Yeah, I think it was just fundamentally that arose from perseverance. In that, I guess, from a psychological point of view, you might call it a growth mindset. I always had this kind of attitude that I might not find it so easy to meet new people, to make new friends, but I always felt like I could improve. And from the end of high school through university and then into my first few jobs as a journalist, I just kept on putting myself out there. And I found that actually at each time I expected that it would be very difficult to make friends and connections, and yet people seemed to warm to me. I made good groups of friends in whatever educational institution or place of work that I arrived at. And so essentially I started to think like maybe all of those fears that I had were unfounded. Now, what I discovered when I was writing The Laws of Connection is that this is actually a very common phenomenon for lots of different people, for the whole population. We all feel very pessimistic about our capacity to connect. And yet, actually, the research shows us when you look at how easily people make friends, when you put groups of strangers in the laboratory together, for example, and get them to chat, it's often much better than people expect. It's a more pleasant experience, and people like you more than you would think. So we consistently underestimate how warmly other people are going to respond to us.
In your research, did you find like the primary causes why we underestimate or minimize like how much somebody's going to enjoy a conversation with us, enjoy the relationship, the time with us? Did you find some of the primary causes of why that is?
Right, so this is known as the liking gap, this phenomenon. And in the laboratory experiments, you get strangers together and they chat for 5 minutes, and you ask them at the end, how much did you like the other person? How much would you like them to be your friend? And guess how much they would like you to be your friend, how much they liked you. And so what we see from that is that our estimates of how other people are feeling are consistently pessimistic. They're worse than those people would actually report. And what I love about this is it's reciprocal. So each person is going away from those conversations thinking, oh my God, I really liked that person. They were smart, they were funny, they were kind, but I don't think they liked me in the same way. So we know that's very robust. And we also know that it emerges very early on in life. So 4-year-olds don't have this liking gap. They take people at face value. And then by the age of 5 and 6, children start second guessing what the other person is thinking. And that comes from this developmental process called the emergence of theory of mind. And that is essentially our ability to put ourselves in other people's shoes. And it seems that by developing this capacity to take others' perspectives, we start to realize that maybe what they're showing us isn't what they really feel. And we become a little bit too concerned about that. We start to second guess all of those overtures of friendship that we're seeing and believing that they're fake. Now, that could be useful in an evolutionary setting or even in the modern world. It pays for you to just be a little bit kind of cautious. You don't want to take people for granted, but it seems that we just do that too much. And if we only turn the dial just a little bit, so we're just a bit braver with other people and maybe a bit easier on ourselves, we would all be a lot happier, and we might make the most of those opportunities for connection. Because one of the consequences of the liking gap is the fact that when we start second guessing what other people are feeling, it discourages us from building on that connection. So we are less likely to then suggest meeting up for coffee the next day or for collaborating at work, for example. So just by changing our attitude even a little bit, you don't have to assume that everyone in the world automatically loves you, but just second guessing yourself, like second guessing your own doubts and thinking, well, I'm worried about that, but I'm going to go ahead anyway. I'm going to put myself out there and suggest that we meet up, even though I'm worried about rejection. That can be just a great way of immediately finding more connection than you realize within your life.
Doubting our doubts.
Yeah, exactly. And that I think that's been the philosophy of my work right through all of the books I've written. Is just question your assumptions, because often they're wrong and they're needlessly negative.
Yeah, exactly. I can relate to that personally, for sure.
Yeah.
Do you think so if that's happening like around the age of, say, 5, you said 5,
Yep.
6,
Yeah, exactly.
do you think there's things we can do as adults, parents, teachers, coaches, those adult figures in caregivers in the children's lives, like at that age, to turn that dial down, to doubt the doubts and like reinforce the positives?
Yeah, I totally do. And, I'm sure lots of parents are doing their best with this anyway, and they may well end up having then more gregarious and sociable children as a result. But I think it's about spotting those moments when your children are feeling maybe a bit shy or nervous, or you see that they've been knocked back by someone and it's leading them to worry that their worst suspicions have been realized. And it's all about having those sensitive conversations with the kids to help them to reframe and reappraise what's going on. So, I think as adults, we forget this, but it's obviously true that people, there's a lot going on in people's lives that we don't know about behind the scenes. And that's just as true for children as well. Like if your kid has found that the person they thought was their friend has been a little bit rude one day, well, who knows what happened? They might have been told off by their parents. They might be scared about an upcoming lesson at school. There's all of these reasons why their mood might have been off that day. And I think as parents, it's really useful to just have that conversation with your child and just discuss those possibilities. That's almost like helping them to develop a more advanced and sophisticated theory of mind, where you're helping them to recognize that there are lots of different explanations for people's behaviors, and the assumptions that you're making might not be the correct one. And that process is known as emotion coaching. It can be useful in all kinds of upsetting situations to encourage the child to learn this process of reappraisal. which is an incredibly useful strategy for all kinds of emotional resilience in lots of different situations. But socially, I think, having those conversations can really help the child to develop their theory of mind further, and also then to kind of be a bit braver in those situations and to get over those moments of rejection, which are painful, but it can help them to get over them a little bit more rapidly.
Yeah, yeah, I love that. Makes me think of a therapist. I think she's in Los Angeles area, California. Lori Gottlieb. I don't know if you're
Yeah,
familiar
yeah,
with
yeah,
her work.
yeah.
She talks about becoming a more accurate narrator of your life.
Yeah, that's exactly the philosophy, is to be a more accurate narrator, like to not let yourself fall into that trap of that ruminative negative thinking, and to just recognize that there's a lot of uncertainty, and then that can be a good thing, that you don't have to that it might seem bad, but there's so much uncertainty that actually there could be other explanations that you don't know about that maybe make the situation more palatable.
Uh-huh. Yeah, it's like it's interesting when you're talking there, it makes me think of like contraction versus expansion. Like the contraction of like, okay, this is the only lane, this is the only possibility versus like there's many possibilities here of like why they may be acting the way they are, and is the story I'm telling myself about this accurate?
Right.
Even questioning
Yeah.
that.
Yeah, that's exactly how I see that. It's opening the mind to new possibilities. And I think it's so much more effective than, say, the worst thing that you could do, I reckon, would be to start kind of trashing the other kid, like you don't want to get too emotionally involved in this because that's actually more upsetting. It's kind of amplifying their feelings of rejection. If you start to say, that was really unkind, you should never speak to them again. It's like, which some parents do, like my own parents would have taken that kind of attitude. And I think that contributed to my shyness in some way. Like, I think as adults, reappraisal is what we should be providing to our kids. We don't want to kind of magnify and amplify the feelings that they're experiencing, but we just want to help the child to shift perspective and find new ways of thinking about it to improve their coping.
What do you think is required then, and what did you have found in the research for the adults to be able to be that skillful?
I mean, the good news is that adults can learn this very quickly. So even if some do it naturally, they might have learned that from their parents, and then it passes on from generation to generation. Yeah, or it could be, not just your parents, it could be grandparents, any adults in your life could really help you to start thinking about situations in that way. But you can teach it to adults as well, just explaining these principles, some very short videos that just kind of talk adults through the process of emotion coaching seem to be very valuable in teaching them the skills that they can then pass on to their children. And that's something again that I kind of try to emphasize with all of my writing on psychology, is that these things aren't fixed in, it's not like we're hardwired at some point to be unable to practice emotion coaching or unable to practice self-compassion towards ourselves. We can learn how to do that ourselves at any age, and then we can help to teach that to other people too.
Yeah. Are you familiar with Dan Gilbert at Harvard,
Yep,
psychologist?
yeah, definitely.
In his TED Talk, the thing that, I told so many people about this over just different conversations. He says, we have this belief as humans that we think we're a finished product, but we're always a work in progress.
Right, exactly. And I guess as I get older, like I'm approaching 40 now, and I kind of think we are a work in progress, and it's certainly not guaranteed that we will get better with age. So I think we do have to be quite conscious about the ways that we're molding our brains and the habits that we're forming. It's not like we end our teens kind of a fully formed adult, but equally at midlife, like we can't just assume that even if you believe in neuroplasticity, which obviously does exist, it doesn't mean that you will automatically get better. We actually have to guard ourselves, I think, against the development of things like resentment and bitterness as we get older.
Yeah. Yeah. Putting the attention in the direction we want to go and the intention into the actions that are going to help us walk into the person that we want to become.
Yeah, exactly. It might be that you kind of need a guiding hand for that with therapy or just with reading books on these subjects. We can't believe that we can do this all by ourselves without any guidance. So we do need to kind of educate ourselves too. But, I strongly believe that it is a process we can all go through to develop a better mindset in our life and to build the skills and the attitudes that we want to. But it starts with intention, like you said. We have to actually want to become that person. And if you look at the research, lots of people really do want to be better people deep down. We all have this view of the true self who is kinder than we're currently acting, more generous, more understanding. And we might just believe that it's not possible to get there, but actually it is within our power. And just by changing our behaviors, building more positive, more compassionate mental habits, day by day, you can achieve that.
Yeah. Little by little, then a little becomes a lot, right? It like
Yeah,
compounds over time. It's like so easy to feel that like in the moment today, this won't add up to much, right? Like when you're making that behavior change. But if you do it, like you're saying, daily or repeatedly, it's like you look back and you're like, whoa.
yeah, yeah, exactly. Like, I don't know if it's like a kind of crazy analogy, but like you look at our ancestors who were migrating across the world, and they could have just been like, "Well, I'm never going to get anywhere, so I'm just going to stay right where I am and not move from this position." But actually, a few steps each day can help you to eventually end up thousands of miles from where you were originally. And what I found with the psychological research on things like changing your mindset is that actually, it does kind of accelerate, but you can't expect the miracles to happen immediately. But like you say, when you look back after a month or after a year, you'll find that the positive change is already very tangible. And the more of it you do, the better you're feeling, the more motivation you'll have to continue in the future too.
Yeah, yeah, that motivation grows, right? Like a
Right.
wave in the ocean. It
Right, yeah,
really,
the more success, yeah, exactly. It's like a wave. It's like the more success that you've seen, the more your self efficacy grows, the more you realize that you are capable of change. And so the more willing you are to take on bigger challenges in the future.
so do you think it's important to, and what you found in the psychological research, to recognize like the little wins?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah, I think like it's bizarre that we're so willing to beat ourselves up over our imperfections and failures, but actually, we really need to focus on those little wins and to learn from them, to recognize what we did well, what we could do to improve, but to not neglect the fact that we have made some progress, and then that in itself deserves to be celebrated.
Yeah. So how do we bring about, you talk about in your book, bringing about greater understanding and affection towards others, right, in relationships. What did you find in the research and you think back your own life, like what are the skills that we can implement to bring about both of those elements?
Yeah, I mean, it's something that I was talking to my boyfriend about this morning, actually, which is that I see that you. So, one of the really fundamental things that I think we forget, a lot of us forget all the time, is that other people might. They're not thinking in the same way as us. And I mean, their brains might just be operating in a way that's slightly different from our own. They're operating from potentially completely different set of assumptions, beliefs. They might have not just different education, but just different experiences that might be shaping how they interpret events. And the one of the things that we can do when we find someone who's acting in a way that we find odd is just to assume that it's stupid, it's ridiculous, to kind of get very angry about it straight away without starting to question, like, well, what were the motivators behind that? What experiences might lead them to think the way they do? And equally, like, what lies at the basis of the assumptions that I'm making in this situation? So, actually, just asking questions in those cases and trying to get a better, just to build your knowledge of like where someone is coming from. That is so fundamental. And what the research shows us is that when you ask those questions and you try to make it clear that you're not being judgmental, it's not some kind of gotcha moment that you're looking for, that you have genuine curiosity. What that research shows is that immediately people's defenses come down. And so they open up and they become more open minded to the way that you're thinking too. And so, again, it's one of those things, it might be just a tiny shift in the kind of tenor of a conversation that eventually allows you to exchange more information and to come to a better place of understanding. So that you might find you've got a lot more in common than you realize. That there are some fundamentals that you agree about. But even with those points that you disagree on, you might find that you have more respect for them. And so that research has been shown, in all different countries with all people from all sides of the political spectrum, for example, and it's very powerful. And it all starts just with not just with kind of showing displays of respect on a very superficial level, but actually just revealing that you have a genuine curiosity in what the other person is thinking and feeling.
Yeah, so it sounds like perspective versus perception. It's like perspective taking. Seeking to understand your perspective rather than just coming at it from the situation from my perception.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. And actually, it's even like the psychologist Nicholas Epley, he makes this distinction between perspective taking and perspective getting. Now, kind of what I was talking about when I mentioned this conversation with my boyfriend was that it's like, you might think that you're taking someone's perspective by imagining yourself in their shoes, but actually your imagination is still limited by your own experiences. Like it's a very, very poor replica of what's actually going on in someone's mind. So the best way to find out what's actually going on in their mind is just to ask them those open questions. So that's perspective getting, is actually saying, like, I don't know what you're thinking really, like I can guess, but I want you to tell me directly. And that, it seems to be what really fosters deeper connection. I mean, taking others' perspectives is good in lots of situations. Like we don't always have someone right in front of us where we can ask them exactly what they're thinking and feeling. So sometimes we have to make a guess. But when you have the opportunity, asking them is so powerful. And, people love the opportunity to be able to open up a bit, and they will reciprocate that in the way that they treat you too.
Yeah, yeah, and just a minute ago you were talking about like when you're coming from a state of genuine curiosity. Like when I am with you, you get a sense, you get a feeling, right? You interpret that's like, okay, I'm not trying to one up you, I'm not trying to get you here. And so it relaxes you to share that next layer,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly how you want to be. I think it's fine actually to express your emotions when you do feel offended by what someone said. Like this isn't about kind of pretending to be people that we're not, pretending that we don't have any feelings. But I still think you can express your disagreement, your anger in a way that is more constructive than we might be tempted to do so, and still, ask people to explain. I guess the curiosity is fundamental there. So even if we feel affronted by something, we can still have that curiosity to know, well, why did they think what they think? Like, and, to ask ourselves, why do we feel as triggered by that as we really do? And maybe to share that with the other person too. It's really, the sharing is important here. It shouldn't be one sided, it should be going both ways. But, what you can do to trigger that process is to be the first one to say, I'm going to ask the questions, and I really genuinely want to know what you have to say. I don't want to judge you. I just want to hear what you have to say.
Yeah, like makes me think of Ted Lasso and be curious, not judgmental.
Yeah, exactly. It's, so fundamental to so many different elements of psychology, and we know that this kind of non-judgmental mindset was so fundamentally important to Buddhism, but it really does work, and it works when we're dealing with our own kind of flaws, but also when we're trying to connect with other people as well.
Yeah, when you were talking earlier, just briefly ago, it made me think like when you were saying asking the question and like, okay, what are you really thinking? What are you really feeling versus trying to make assumptions? It made me think of like my artwork versus my daughter's.
Right.
It's like I have this mental image of what I wanted to draw or paint or something like that. And then I look at it next to hers or someone else's and I'm like, whoa, that's so way different.
Yeah, in a good
It's
way
like,
or a bad way.
yeah, like in a bad way for me. Like, I like struggle with the art. Although I
Yeah.
haven't, when you talk about like the learning, I haven't taken many art classes. So
Right.
that's another like layer element. It's easy to feel like, okay, well, I'll never be able to do this, but like maybe I haven't developed the skill to see it in a certain way, to draw it in a certain way, or paint it in a certain way.
Yep, totally. And actually, there's really good research on this, and it kind of drives me crazy that in English schools, and I think it is probably true of the US as well, that we're not really taught art systematically in the same way that we're taught maths. And actually, there are definitely templates, structures, like schemas, we would say in psychology, that can instantly improve how you're drawing something representatively. Like there is definitely a learnable skill that can be taught very systematically, but we're just not provided that education, and so we just assume we don't have the talent unless we're one of those people who just by chance comes across the right strategies. But it could be made so much easier, and I think that's the same in so many different domains. Whether it's music, writing, social skills. So much of what seems to me the fundamentals of education is left to chance, and there's only comparatively few disciplines like mathematics or history where we might be taught in this very incremental process, but actually we should be applying that to all of these other creative or social pursuits.
Yeah, yeah, a systematic approach. It's like, well, if there's a systematic approach for learning addition and subtraction, how come we don't use a systematic approach for anything else? It's
Yeah,
like, what?
yeah,
That makes
exactly.
zero sense.
Right, and exactly. And so, like, say babies can and toddlers can pick up languages super easily without tuition, but they're going through like an intense process of trial and error, which once you get to your, late childhood or as an adult, we don't have the chance to do that. So obviously we have like language lessons where you learn the basic vocabulary that you learn, and then you learn how to fit it together in more sophisticated forms using different grammatical rules, and we build it up from something basic to something very complicated to fluency. And we should be doing the same with something like art. Yeah, like that's something I really strongly believe in.
Yeah, and with building connections and
Yeah.
maintaining connections, because our lives would be so much better in all respects having that systematic approach versus it almost feels like a floundering, like
Yeah.
happenstance.
It really is floundering. And so, there are definitely good social skills that we could be taught, how to ask questions, how to ask the right kinds of questions in the way that I described. What makes a good apology, for example, how we can regulate our own emotions when we're feeling angry so we don't kind of lash out. Practices like self-affirmation, for example, can be very useful, where once you start thinking about your own values, that can help you to put your kind of problems in perspective. So say an argument with a spouse becomes much less serious if you start thinking of the bigger picture of what you really value in life. All of these things are skills that could be taught, but we're not really taught them. It's just, luck whether we happen to meet someone who managed to instill that within us or not. But actually, for our education, we could be getting more of this advice. And what I love about this, like, I think for some people, it might seem a bit like, oh God, like, do we really want every conversation to be very scripted and staged, in that way? But that's not how I see it at all. These are fundamental skills. But then the point is that then once you have them, you're still learning to apply them in more sophisticated ways. You're improvising. It's like a great jazz musician, goes through an intense period of training to learn that instrument, but then they learn how to apply that in lots of different ways, and they can be very creative and spontaneous. And that's how we should be with our conversational skills when we're trying to relate to other people, when we're trying to reflect and regulate our own feelings. We can have the fundamental skills, and the more we know, the more tools we have at our disposal, or the more schemas we have that we could apply, the better able we are to adapt to the situation at hand.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I mean, you mentioned that word fundamentals. It's almost
Yeah.
like it feels like in society a lot of times we don't even know what the fundamentals are, and then we don't continually practice the fundamentals like as a society. So then it's like that would make zero sense if you were learning to play the guitar.
Right.
Like
Yeah,
like
exactly.
what? Like good luck.
Right, exactly. And then, it would create a lot of noise. And then you look at like the discussions that happen on social media and you think that is basically what we're witnessing. There's a whole lot of noise without achieving much. People who feel very passionately. I'm not just talking about trolls, I'm talking about people, activists who feel very passionately about what they believe, but they are just not applying what I think are the fundamentals of persuasive argument to communicate their point in a way that is going to persuade people. And instead, it comes across like kids in the playground. It's like, you're ugly. No, you're ugly. It's like, you know, it's often not better than that. And I think it just shows how we lack sophisticated social skills.
Yeah, yeah. Your dad's more ugly than my dad.
Right, exactly. Yeah.
Exactly. And then sharing that out on social media, like,
Yeah.
great. That's
Right. I mean, it's like this fundamental failure in applying your theory of mind. The fact that people are saying these kinds of things, and they're not even considering what that makes them look like to other people, and like how someone who might have been naturally inclined to agree with them is going to be really turned off by seeing that nastiness. And we see that on social media. There's this principle called the Montague principle, which is named after an English aristocrat from the 18th century called Lady Wortley Montague, Lady Mary Wortley Montague. And she just had this kind of saying that civility costs nothing and buys everything. And we see on social media when people are nasty, you don't just alienate the people you're disagreeing with, you alienate the people who could be your supporters. And it's been shown time and time again, and in the laboratory with fictional examples, with real life examples, in all kinds of situations. But most people are forgetting this, what I think is a very basic principle of good communication, is that you don't insult the people you're trying to convince.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah, that's really fascinating. It makes me think Warren Buffett has a saying um, that he says, and I'm sure he read it along the way or heard it along the way. It's be general in your criticism and specific in your praise.
Yeah, yeah. I have to say, I would disagree with Warren Buffett there. Yeah, I think both criticism and praise would be better to be very specific. I think generalizations are not that helpful in any situation because like at school, for example, I used to like when teachers were grading like my essays, and if they were like great, some would literally just write great work at the bottom. It's like, well, I don't know what I did well here or what I could do to improve. Like, for my growth, I need to have the details. But similarly, I think like if one of my teachers was great, she would always give me a real breakdown of exactly what was good and what was bad, and it stung a little bit reading the criticisms, but actually it felt very productive too. Like it was much easier for me to think like, hey, I'll swallow my disappointment and get on with improving this because I know exactly how to act now that you've given me that list. And we do see that in the psychology. So like my teacher, Mrs. Smith, was correct in that actually specific feedback that's actionable is much easier to swallow, but also specific praise is fantastic too because again you're helping people to learn, but more importantly it's showing that you're really paying attention to them, you're really noticing what they've done well. And what's fundamental to good relationships is attention. It's showing that you've noticed someone, and the more particular you can be in that, the stronger that sense comes across.
That makes a lot of sense because if I demonstrate appreciation for you in a general way, you're like, do you feel like it's like fake or superficial?
Yeah.
You're
Well,
not
yeah, it's
connecting.
again, we start second guessing that, don't we? Whereas it's much harder to second guess something if someone is, saying like, I really liked this sentence in particular in that article that you wrote, or I thought the argument itself was just so well balanced and perceptive. That's really letting the person know that there was something substantial to your praise rather than just this kind of desire to please you.
So in like, what do you feel like are there like common or most common like psychological barriers to building the connection? And then are those different than the psychological barriers to maintaining connection?
Yeah, I mean, so my book is divided into two parts actually. So building connections and then maintaining connections. And they're very related, but there are some differences. I mean, there's kind of 13 laws in total that I describe. So the building connection, I think the fundamental thing is this liking gap. It's trusting that other people like you more than you assume, so you can be a bit braver in trying to build on that connection and to help that little seed grow into this kind of beautiful plant of friendship. But then, with maintaining connections, I think like showing gratitude is one of the really important things that we can do to help people to know that they're still important to us. And again, being as specific as possible and showing them what we appreciate is fundamental. When we have those disagreements, showing that curiosity about the other person, using those exercises in taking perspective. By that, I mean considering your values, what really matters to you, considering how this relationship plays out in your views of your future life, and recognizing how small the current conflict may be in that context can be very powerful. So that's one of the laws of connection, is to try to take perspective in your relationships. Yeah, I think, it's all, I mean, fundamentally, they're all about creating this shared reality, is what the researchers call it, and the term I use throughout the book. And that is just like to build a strong relationship with someone. It's not enough to just be kind of similar people. You really want to know that their brain is operating fundamentally in a very similar way to yours, at least on some kind of fundamental level. And it could just be acknowledging that, you both laugh at the same kinds of jokes, or that you find one piece of music to be incredibly beautiful. That can be the spark that leads you to consider the possibility of having a shared reality with someone. But even when we have these kind of conflicts, you're always aiming to get back to that shared reality, to recognize that even if there are points of disagreement, there are still areas of your worldview, of your kind of your values, your beliefs, what it means to be human, that you share with that other person, that you are fundamentally two human beings who are living in the world at the same time and seeing it in the same way.
Yeah. So when we're having, we were talking about like social media or just in the world today, when we're having this disagreement, we're at odds. Let's say you and I are at odds. I don't see that,
Right.
but
Yeah.
but but how do we seek out that shared reality when, let's say, one situation or conversation or something, it feels so overwhelming, feels so powerful, it's like it's a divisive feeling.
Yeah. I mean, it's really difficult to overcome, obviously, but it is possible. I mean, one of the problems I think now is that, if we don't spend much time with those people, we lack opportunities to discover what we do share, like what parts of reality are overlapping for each of us. But, one of my favorite experiments looked at, for example, how people responded during the solar eclipse, for example, over multiple solar eclipses. And what that research shows is that when you have this kind of really awe-inspiring event, that everyone is appreciating that enormous beauty of what's happening in the sky, well, then they start to feel more of a connection with the people around them, because that, in those moments, that is the shared reality of everyone. They're all focusing on the same thing. They're all experiencing this wonder at nature together. Now, solar eclipses don't happen that often, but I still think, there should be more opportunities in life for that. It could be recognizing that some piece of music, going to a concert with someone that you disagree with, but recognizing that you can both really bond over your admiration for that artist or the emotions that they're sharing. It could be recognizing like just how much they love their family and how much you love your family, and that fundamental value is something that is unquestionable for both of you. But we need to look for those opportunities. They can be small, they can be big, all of them are powerful. But if we solely focus on the difference, we're never going to get there. And I think that's partly, especially what's wrong with online communication, is that we're not seeing these people in their everyday lives. All we're seeing is their angry words, which are so violently opposed to the words that we're saying and the beliefs that we hold. And so that's why, polarization is increasing. Whereas when people were communicating more face to face, and you were socializing at the school gates or whatever, there was just so much more opportunity to build that shared reality.
Yeah, yeah. So yeah, that's fascinating, David, because it's like seeking out. It sounds like it's so important to seek out these opportunities for connection rather than this spotlight effect shining solely on the one difference.
Yep. Yeah, exactly. And so, I mean, this is like a very extreme example that I give in my book, but it was documented by a psychologist, a case study. And it was this woman who, as a teenager, she'd had a really tough time in her family, and she had kind of got involved in this group of like racist thugs. And, she turned out to, was involved in a lot of crimes and, had some pretty reprehensible views. She eventually landed in prison for her crimes. But while she was in prison, a black inmate who she would have normally been very hostile towards saw she was on her own and offered her a cigarette. And they got speaking, and things didn't change overnight. But she really started to form a connection with this other woman, and then with her friends within the prison as well. And, it was over a period of months and years, but eventually she came to completely disown all of her previous beliefs. And it all came from that moment of connection, right at the start of her time in prison. And I think that's just one example of this, and it's an extreme example. And, I can't say that everyone would react in that way, but she obviously had that kind of humanity within her, an open enough mind that she was able to question all that she had been led to believe and to then form those connections. And I found that very moving and very powerful. And I think the research, in laboratory studies, longitudinal studies, it might not have the power of that one case study, but it all shows that fundamentally that principle of sharing reality with someone, opening up to like a very basic experience with someone, can help you to start shifting your attitudes towards them and to building a connection even where you didn't believe it would exist beforehand.
Yes. Yeah, that is incredibly powerful. About 25 years ago, when I was in university, college, this gentleman came and told his story, his life story. Have you ever seen the movie with Edward Norton Jr., American History X?
I haven't, I'm afraid.
Okay, so it's a true story. It's about this gentleman came. It's about he ended up leading the biggest neo-Nazi movement in the state of California. He was
Wow.
head of
Yeah.
that, and he went to jail. And so he was like, I hate blacks, hate minorities, people of color, all this. He's just building that infrastructure in California throughout the state. Goes to jail, and then he starts interacting with Hispanics and black people in there, not at first, right? And but he's like very similar. He's like, I never like spent time around them, and it started changing the way he was thinking, combined with he had a son, and he's on the outside, the son on the outside, he's on the inside, and he's like, well, wait, what type of world community, society do I really want my son to grow up in? And he did a full 180, gets out of jail, out of prison, and he ends up working for the Peace and Tolerance Institute in Los Angeles, California, and going around speaking about humanity and shared values and understanding and all this. He came to my school and spoke, and there's the movie with Edward Norton Jr., American History X, depicting this, and I'm just like, whoa, what a total transformation.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, these examples do exist, like Megan Phelps Roper as well. Like it might not be common, but I think it does show that it is possible. And the case study I was talking about, she similarly, joined these kind of de-radicalization organizations to try to persuade other people who might be going down the same path that she was to kind of rethink their life choices. I do find it inspiring. Like when you're telling me that story, it gives me kind of goosebumps, because I think like the news coverage that we hear is often just so negative, and we believe that people are so entrenched in their opinions that there's no hope for change. And so I think that then leads us to become more entrenched in our own opinions, to be more hostile to these people. And actually, if we just recognize that there's much more potential for constructive dialogue than we believed and for the change of opinion than we believed, we could really achieve the kind of society that we want to live in.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Do you know who Richard Feynman was?
Yeah, I love him. Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, the
yeah.
physicist. Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
exactly. And he said, I think he said, one of my life goals is to get to the end of my life and potentially change all my opinions, all my belief systems. Like that's a life
Right.
well lived.
Yeah, no, I really think that is something that we should be open to doing. Like, I think that is a life well lived. I think that is how you're going to achieve wisdom, is to be open to the possibility that you can change your belief systems, and that nothing, or almost nothing, is so sacred that you can't be persuaded to change with enough evidence.
Yeah. Um, as we're coming up on time, coming close, are there questions I haven't asked you that you wanted to, touch on or share, or, some closing thoughts? Yeah, what's on your mind?
Yeah, so one thing that I kind of briefly mentioned earlier, but was the importance of self compassion. And, learning about self compassion really has changed my life. And that is, I think we assume that self compassion, like the term, sounds a bit nauseating almost. And,
Yeah.
we live in societies where we really value self criticism and holding ourselves to high standards. And I think the assumption is if you're too kind to yourself, you're not really going to achieve anything, materially, but also you're not really going to become a better person, because you're just going to, if you forgive yourself for your errors, you're never going to change the way that you act. The research shows the exact opposite is true. People who have more self compassion, who can recognize their errors, but don't beat themselves up or tell themselves that they're a terrible person fundamentally for having made those mistakes, they are much more likely to then make positive changes afterwards. And we can see that in everything from, self-compassionate students. If they do bad in one paper, they're much more likely to study harder for the next paper. But we see that also in kind of social interactions. If you've offended someone, and you're self-compassionate about that, like you recognize that it was a mistake, but that, human beings make mistakes and it's a natural part of relationships, they're much more likely to apologize and to make amends for what they've done. Whereas if you're really self-critical, it almost becomes so painful, you don't want to turn your mind towards that. And the result is you don't make amends and you end up making the same mistake again and again. So it's just something that I practice all the time with myself now. And it's the kind of one skill I wish I'd been able to learn when I was that really shy teenager, was just recognizing that, it's okay to fail sometimes, to make mistakes, that beating myself up is only going to be counterproductive, and that actually, suffering is part of the human experience. And recognizing that everyone is going through some kind of pain in their life in ways that you can't recognize. It helps us feel more connected to those other people, and it helps us to be more forgiving of ourselves for feeling that pain in the first place. So it's so powerful in so many different ways for helping us to move on with our lives and to build a better future for ourselves.
Yeah, yeah. I appreciate you saying that. What does your practice look like, if you're willing to share?
Yeah, I mean, sometimes it's just kind of noticing when I'm being self-critical. So, in like acceptance and commitment therapy, you're taught, to kind of watch, to kind of almost float above your thoughts again, being kind of quite non-judgmental about them, but recognizing when you're going into this kind of catastrophizing way of reasoning where you might be really beating yourself up over something. And, you can just recognize that's your inner critic and just tell yourself, I don't have to listen to what it's saying, or I don't have to believe what it's saying. So that is a very useful exercise. You can imagine your thoughts as being like trains passing in a station. You don't have to get on board each of those trains. Some of them you can just let them go on without getting caught up in the kind of cycle that they're bringing to you. There are self-compassion meditations that you can listen to online. So you can find some through the website of Kristin Neff, who is
Yeah.
one of the major researchers behind self-compassion. So, I just often listen to just a 5-minute meditation that essentially just reminds me of, to treat myself kindly and to recognize the shared humanity of experiencing suffering. And the research shows that actually those self-compassion meditations It can bring all the benefits of mindfulness as well, of, say, a breathing exercise or a body scan. So it's actually just a very good meditative exercise. Sometimes I might engage in expressive writing, which, I might just kind of process what I'm thinking and feeling and try to end that with a kind of distanced reflection on what I've been through, and incorporating self-compassion into that. So just recognizing that sometimes these negative experiences happen and they're a part of life and we can learn from them, but we don't have to blame ourselves for them. So all of that I find very useful, and it's the kind of thing that once you start practicing it for a few weeks even, it kind of becomes second nature. And for me, it just had a really big impact, I think, on feelings of burnout, my social confidence, my mental health, all of these things. It's a very productive exercise for me.
Yeah, were you at all surprised when you started that process, that ritual, like you talked about, that you became, maybe if you became like more productive or more effective? Because
Yeah,
I ask because like there's in the US a lot, maybe the Western world, like there's this idea like it has to be hard, like you have to be, yeah, so tough on yourself, otherwise you're not going to achieve anything. Um,
yeah,
that
no,
Puritan approach.
I love that you raised that, actually, because that's exactly what I experienced. So like, I'm a freelance writer,
Yeah.
I can make my own hours, but for some reason, because of the Puritan mindset, work ethic, I would feel like if I'm not working from like 9 till 6 solidly, I'm not being productive. I would feel a lot of guilt sometimes, even for like going to make myself a coffee, like worse than I would have done in the office, because I couldn't say, oh, like I'm present in the office, so that's part of doing my job. I felt like I had to be like at my laptop the whole time. But then, practicing things like self-compassion, it did make me think like, I'm in charge of my workflow. If I want to go for a half hour's walk every morning to a cafe to work for an hour, and then have a half hour's walk back and take a break after lunch, and then go to the gym at 4 o'clock, that is fine. I don't have to beat myself up about that. And the irony is that once I started doing that, I actually became a lot more effective at what I'm doing. So my routines just became more efficient. In the moments when I am at my desk, I'm focusing a lot more. So I'm writing more than I ever had done, but also spending less time doing it. And I don't think I could have achieved that if I hadn't learnt to treat myself with self-compassion, and to realize that I don't have to have like this imaginary boss in my head, like cracking a whip to like
Yes.
boost my output.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Um, the writer C.S. Lewis, who taught at Oxford there in the
Yeah.
UK, used to say, when you put first things first, second things are not suppressed, they actually increase.
Yeah, that's exactly how I see it. Is and I kind of use my metacognition. So it's like, if I'm not being productive enough, which happens sometimes, then I would obviously shift my routine a little bit. But ultimately, I think C.S. Lewis is right there. It's like, if you can take care of your mind's health, that is really good for things like creativity and productivity. And um, I could tie myself to the desk and I probably just wouldn't be coming up with so many ideas, or I'd be mind wandering. I'd have that kind of afternoon slump where I can't really work anyway. If I'm going to be a little bit inefficient in these moments, I might as well be doing something that's good for my health in general.
Mhm. Makes me think back to when I was a kid and I'd be struggling with math. Like math didn't come easy to me. But when I would take a break and do anything else, could be shooting hoops or it could be working on my English or science or whatever, and then I come back to it, it's like, oh, there it is.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. No, I had exactly the same thing. And like, sometimes my mum, I'd be like getting really frustrated late at night, not being able. I studied maths at university too, and I'd be like super frustrated, and my mum would be like, "You just have to stop now. Like, it will come to you tomorrow." And I would be like, "Oh no, I just have to finish this. I can't get to sleep." But obviously, then it did just come much better. It would just be like a flash of insight
Yes.
that came so easily. And so that really, even from, when I, that was in high school when I went to university then and studied maths, that was like, the other mathematicians always used to comment that my day's workflow was like just very like regimented in a way. It's like they would be working late into the evening and stuff, but I would just like finish at 4 or 5, and that was it. Like I knew that if I couldn't do something that day, it would come to me the next day, but there was no point in kind of forcing it when it wasn't flowing properly.
Yeah, it's hard to push a rope.
Right, yeah, exactly.
It's much
Yeah.
easier, it's much better to pull a rope than to push a rope.
Yeah, exactly. And we treat our minds as if like they're machines. It's almost like a sausage machine or whatever, where you're like cranking out the mince. Like, and it's a ridiculous way to think about something as kind of beautiful and kind of resilient but fragile as the brain. Like it actually, we need to treat it with more respect and not to see it as just another kind of machine that has like a certain amount of output that we can, force ourselves to produce every day, come rain or shine.
Yeah, and I like that the taking it from treating ourselves that way gives us the capacity to treat others that way, right? Like treating other people's brains and other people's lives with the respect that we start treating ourselves, like showing that compassion to others as well, allows for, it's like full circle, allows for the relationships to broaden and deepen. Do you
Yeah.
think?
Yeah, no, I do. I mean, it's like, sometimes I've come across people and, like colleagues who would be quite critical and they'd be like, oh, I'd only treat myself with the same kind of judgment. And I feel like, fine, but just because you're making yourself miserable doesn't mean that you have to make me miserable as well. Like
Exactly.
you could have said that feedback, more constructively than you did. And I don't care if you then going to beat yourself up over something mistake that you've done in the future. Like it's not helping either of us. The fact that you're unhappy. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, David, this has been a beautiful, fun conversation for me. I hope it was for you.
Yeah. No, it really was. Thank you. Yeah.
And I really appreciate you coming on and sharing these insights and your personal reflections, because I think my audience can really benefit from reading your work and listening to this podcast and reflecting on, oh, how do they want to treat themselves and how do they want to treat others going forward in a time and an age and a society that like is almost trying to force them to act a certain way.
Yeah, exactly. Like we need to react against some of these things that have become societal norms and they're just not making anyone happy or healthy. We talk a lot about reducing our reliance on things like junk food, but there's just a huge amount in our culture that's the equivalent of junk food for our brains and for our mental health, and we need to overcome that.
Yeah, yeah. Well, thank you so much.
It's been a real pleasure for me.
Thank you for listening to this episode. I hope you enjoyed it. Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, and if you liked it, please share with a friend on social media. That goes a long way to promoting this podcast so I can continue to interview and share these conversations with fascinating people. You can follow me on social media, Chad Stoloff, and visit my website, chadstoloff.wordpress.com, for more information. I'd love it if you would leave a review to support the podcast. Thanks so much. Until next time.